Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll just make sure we are working. Okay, so before I begin, I just want to remind you that we are a publicly traded company, and this presentation contains forward-looking statements, so I'd encourage you to look at our documents on file with the SEC for further information. So Vericel is a leader in providing advanced cell therapies for the sports medicine and severe burn markets. So we have a highly innovative advanced therapy platform. Our products are combination device biologics, that's how they're regulated by the FDA, that use a patient's own cells, that's the biologic component obviously, to repair tissues and restore function. Our lead product is MACI, which was approved in December of 2016 and launched last year for the treatment of cartilage defects in the knee. It's the first tissue-engineered autologous cellularized scaffold product that was approved by the FDA, and it's clearly the leading restorative cartilage repair product in the market. VCEL is the only FDA-approved permanent skin replacement for full-thickness burns for severely burned patients with large total body surface area burns. So those are our products, and they are highly efficacious products. So in our pivotal study for MACI, the response rate for patients treated with MACI was nearly 90%. And likewise, for severe burn patients that are treated with VCEL, the survival rate is upwards of 90% as well. So highly efficacious products, and really attractive products from a business perspective as well. So as I mentioned, they are the only FDA-approved products in their class. And as autologous cell therapies, they're not subject to generic competition. So there's no ANDA process or no biosimilar pathway for these products. So we think they're very attractive, long-lived assets. We clearly have positioned the company as a top-tier revenue growth story. So we reported record revenues in the fourth quarter of about $23.5 million. And we have a very seasonal business, so we always compare our revenues to the same quarter in the prior year. And revenues were up 41% in the fourth quarter of 2017 versus Q4 2016. And that was our third straight quarter of 30% or higher growth. And it was driven both by the launch of MACI last year, as I mentioned, as well as a resurgence in the growth of VCEL. And we think there's a lot of room left to grow. So our total revenues for the year were about $64 million. That's in a context of north of $600 million addressable markets, and they're relatively underpenetrated and growing. So we think we have an opportunity to provide sustainable double-digit growth moving forward. We actually purchased the commercial business from Sanofi. This was part of Genzyme's biosurgery business. We purchased it a few years ago, and we actually make these products in a single facility in Cambridge. And, we have a great potential for significant margin expansion as well. So with continued volume growth and higher utilization of our manufacturing facility, we see a significant increase in gross margins. So the marginal cost for producing MACI and VCEL is about 20%. So about 80% of every incremental revenue dollar falls to the gross margin line. And likewise, these are premium priced products. So a MACI implant is about $40,000. The average VCEL order is about $200,000, and we have relatively concentrated call points. So we've expanded our sales force for MACI up to 40 representatives. There's about 5 VCEL representatives. So premium priced products, very concentrated call points, and we see a nice operating income leverage as well, where about 50% of every incremental revenue dollar falls to the operating margin line. And again, we expect that with this increased revenue growth, we'll continue to see operating income improvements as well. And then finally, we have a very strong institutional healthcare shareholder base. We have enough cash on hand to fund operations to reach profitability. So that's kind of the high-level storyline for us. Innovative products, strong revenue growth, expanding margins, cash on hand to get to profitability, and we believe we're poised for strong earnings growth going forward. So when we bought the business, it was pretty flat to declining, about $40 million in revenues, even ahead of the MACI launch and getting a pediatric label expansion for Epicel, which has helped fuel its growth. We're still growing at high single digits to low double digits, but the growth, as I mentioned, is really accelerated in the past couple quarters, and both products are growing strongly. So MACI growth is accelerating as we move through its initial launch quarters, and a really nice resurgence in the Epicel growth, second straight quarter of 60% plus growth for a product that's been on the market for almost 20 years. So that's a really nice story as well. So we think we're well on our way with this product portfolio to achieving, our target profile in 2020, which is a company with $100 million plus in revenues, attractive gross margins north of 60%. And again, we feel like we're well on our way. But we also think about long-term, growth for the company and maximizing value. And so from a business development perspective, we clearly spend time thinking about how do we continue to grow our sports medicine franchise with additional products, our burn franchise, and then leverage, I believe we're the only company in the country that has, multiple cell therapies that are being commercialized. And so we clearly have manufacturing, development, regulatory capabilities that if we have opportunities to enter into new verticals, we look at those opportunities as well. So that's the 30-second elevator speech in 5 minutes, and I guess we'll start with some questions.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm sort of, struck by the acceleration of the business, and in fact could be considered maybe a case study in terms of business acceleration. Could you talk a little bit about the factors behind MACI? Well, actually, let's start there. You mentioned something like 40 representatives, obviously on the supply side, but what's going on to drive the growth you've seen there, both on the demand and supply side?
Yeah, that's a great question. So MACI is a next generation product. So it's referred to as a third generation autologous, which means the patient's own cells, cell therapy product for knee cartilage defects. And so it replaced a product called Carticel, which was the product that was on the market when we originally purchased the business. And there's really sort of 4 factors that are leading to the strong MACI growth. The first is the label. So Carticel was a second-line therapy. You had to have failed a prior surgical procedure. It was limited to defects in certain parts of the knee. And so MACI has a much more expansive label. So it's a first-line therapy, cartilage defects anywhere in the knee, no limits on size, location, bone involvement or not. So what that does is increase the eligible patient population that could be treated with MACI. Secondly, it's a much easier surgical procedure. So Carticel was a very technically demanding procedure, time consuming. You had to open up the whole knee, microsuture, you can think of a cartilage defect as like a pothole. And so you had this microsuture, a cover over the defect, and then inject the cells. Whereas MACI, we seed the cells onto a collagen membrane. You simply cut the membrane to the size of the defect, glue it in place, and you're done. So it's much simpler, much faster. And what that does is increase the number of surgeons that are interested in using the product. So we mentioned on our last earnings call, we had trained over 600 surgeons, and over half of them were surgeons that didn't use Carticel. So clearly expanding the surgeon base. Third is the clinical data. So there's no product on the market that's demonstrated superiority versus microfracture, which is a common procedure where if you have a defect, they go in and they drill into the bone. The theory being that the bone marrow cells will bleed into the defect and it forms a scab, or fibrocartilage scab, but it really doesn't have durability of repair. So we have superior clinical data. We just published 5-year data, which is unusual when you've only been on the market for a year, that you have 5-year data. So the benefits we saw at 2 years, highly statistically significant, were carried out to 5 years. And then because it's a much less invasive procedure, the rehab protocol is much shorter. So it's a combination of all those factors that are really driving MACI growth.
So then how about Epicel, which, as you mentioned, has been around much longer? How do you get a product like that to accelerate?
Well, when we bought the business from Sanofi, they had basically, it was an unpromoted product, essentially. They had one sales rep left. They had taken essentially there's only 100 or so burn centers in the country, so you never need a real large sales force. But they had taken most of the sales force out of the field. There was one sales rep. So we knew sort of going into the business that putting the feet back out on the street would be important. And, we quickly got back to historically high volumes. And then, we were able to, Epicel was approved as a humanitarian use device, so there were pricing restrictions and so on. Once you get a pediatric label, those things go away. So we've been able to sort of price the product appropriately. And really, we knew the second layer of growth was going to be expanding the number of burn centers in the country that used the product. So when we bought the business, there were about 20 centers in the U.S. that used Epicel. There were 40 centers last year. And that's really about medical education, training other institutions on how to use the product effectively, et cetera. So, it's a life-saving product. When you have these catastrophic burn patients, and we typically treat patients who have 70, 80, even 90% total body surface area burns, their only other alternatives are sort of serial autografts where you take off the epidermis, you run it through a mesher, you try to cover the wounds. Obviously a very poor cosmetic result, but this is a potentially life-saving product, and really putting the resources behind it. It's gratifying for us to be able to treat more patients, and obviously there was a need out there.
Great. So 30% plus growth for 3 quarters, with the fourth quarter showing 41%. So what are your plans for the long term?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think because these are the only products that are approved in their class at the present time, we think we can sustain this double-digit growth for the foreseeable future. And as I mentioned, that should position us for the financial profile that we are looking to achieve, which we think is attractive to investors and others. And then, business development opportunities to continue to grow the business.
Great. And then just from the perspective of your subsegment of cell and gene therapy, has the space arrived? And what do you think the market might be missing about the space or your company specifically?
Well, we've had a pretty nice run. I think our stock is up over 300% in the last year and over 100% year to date. So I think our story is becoming known, right? And you see other examples in this space. Axogen's a typical example. They're in the nerve regeneration business, and you just keep knocking out these quarter after quarter of strong growth, and people start to notice, right? And I think, that's been our experience to date, although we're still in very early days. I think for the sector as a whole, it's always been my goal to demonstrate that you can actually have a successful commercial business in this space, right? So, years ago we were talking about the fact that, hey, this is much like therapeutic antibodies, right? It took 10 to 20 years for these things to finally kind of gain traction. And I think we're seeing the same thing in the cell and gene space, where you're seeing a number of clinical successes for sure, right? With, the different cell and gene therapy approaches that we've seen. You've seen a number of new approvals with CAR T therapies. So all of that's moving up the chain. You haven't to date seen a lot of commercial successes, and we're hoping that we're on the forefront of that and, becoming one of the first profitable cell and gene therapy companies in the United States.
Great. Just in the last minute, are there any questions from the audience? From way back there in the corner. Question is, what's happening outside the U.S.?
Yeah, so for us, we own global rights to these products, which is great. So again, long-lived assets, global rights, no milestones or royalties. We did enter into a partnership in Asia with a company called Innovative Cellular Therapeutics last year. And so, they have rights to our entire portfolio in China, Korea, and other Asian countries. So there's an opportunity for us there. The market's challenging in Europe. So we own, MACI was approved in Europe. It was one of the first advanced therapy medicinal products, tissue engineered products that was approved in Europe. When we bought the business, we actually suspended commercialization in Europe. There was a big facility there that Genzyme owned or Sanofi owned that we shut down. It just wasn't viable economically. The market is challenging. I'd say of the first 5 or 6 advanced therapies that were approved in Europe, I'm not aware that any of them are even on the market anymore. So we really, at this time, don't plan to enter the European market. We may do it moving forward on a country-by-country basis as we see things evolve.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, thank you very much.